My name is Chris Evans, Extension Forester with the University of Illinois. Today's topic for the webinar is the rarest trees of Illinois. And that's a big topic. There's a lot of cool trees out here that are pretty rare, so we definitely can't cover them all. What I wanted to do today instead was just hit a highlight of some of the rare species we have. But I'll start with a little background on Illinois forest. And then get into a discussion on why species are rare, why we consider species rare, what that means, and then highlight some of these rare tree species in Illinois, and then end with a few minutes on kind of management and protection. What are we doing about these rare species? But just to jump into the background of Illinois forest, it goes all the way back to the Cretaceous period, back when we had oceanfront property in southern Illinois that really influenced our geology, our topography in this region. So we have bluffs and sandstone and limestone. So that was a major factor kind of influencing the underlying geology and soils for the southern part of the state. And then the rest of the state really has varied geologic history with glaciers as well. And so we have a lot of influences in the state that have impacted Illinois historically. You add to that, historic droughts, people's use of fire, and then it ended up really Illinois was a shifting mosaic of prairie, savanna, woodland, and enclosed forest. So we had all these different habitats kind of moving back and forth in the state as these influences waxed and waned, as droughts or more moist conditions happened. And that's kind of where the matrix of habitat we've had that our trees in our communities developed in. Historically, we think around the time of European settlement, Illinois had about a little under 14 million acres of forest in the state. It's about 37% of our land area. Currently, we're about 14% of land area, or close to 5 million acres. And it's a pretty diverse forest. We do have over 180 species of trees or shrubs that are native to Illinois. That includes things like 20 oak species, 10 hickory species. Even though the forest is 14% of the state, it's vital to 70% of our diversity. So I was blown away when I came to Illinois and really started seeing just how diverse our forests are in this state. So that's kind of the context of where we're coming with our forestry in the state, our diversity in the state. Let's get into these rare species. So what is a rare species? That's a term, it's a little ambiguous. What do we talk about when we say a species is rare? Overall, we're just saying it's something that's not found or encountered that often. And that could mean simply that there's not many individuals or populations of that species that occur in Illinois. So there's one, that could be a species that's in decline, or a species that's only found in a very small geographical region. There's different ways or different reasons, kind of why we call a species rare. Another interesting one is it may not be rare, but we think it's rare because it's a cryptic species. It may be something that's hard to find, hard to see, or hard to recognize, even though it actually may be common. And one example I think of that is a woody vine. It's not a tree, but is American bittersweet. So we've all heard of Oriental bittersweet, which is the real problematic invasive. We do have a native American bittersweet vine, and it's one that for the longest time I called it a fairly rare species. Although once I really kind of figured out how to recognize it and understood kind of where it grows and what it looks like, I started finding it more and more. And I think it's a lot less rare than I thought at first. And so this was more of a cryptic species. It really shows up at a certain time of year when those fruit are red. But other than that, it doesn't grow in big patches, and you would not recognize it easily. So I think this is somewhat of a cryptic species, one that kind of gets mixed in with a bunch of other vines, and it's probably a lot more common than we actually think it is. And you can see it's found across the state. So rare in some ways, but not rare in others. But why are species rare? There's some species that are just always rare. Those species may need a very specific habitat, and that habitat is not very abundant on the landscape. It could be that it's always rare in our state because we're at the edge of their range, their habitat suitability. And so it's just never going to be very abundant just for climatic reasons. Or it could be that a species is rare because it's in decline. It was once formerly more common, and then now it's much less so. The populations are decreasing. And that could be because there's some kind of stressor or impact affecting the population. It could be a disease issue. It could be competition with an invasive species. It could be deer overbrowse. There's a lot of reasons why a species may go into decline, or a lot of stressors. Or it could be simply that the habitat or the climate is shifting away from those ideal conditions. One good example of that would be the fire suppression that's happened over the last 80 or 100 years. Fire-dependent species with the absence of regular fire may be in decline because that habitat is changing and shifting away from what they really need. There's a bunch of different reasons. I want to spend a few minutes on this idea of at the edge of their range. And we see that a lot in Illinois, largely because if you look at the southern part of the state, we are at the confluence of 4 major physiographic regions. And so groups like habitats or regions like the Ozarks barely get into Illinois. The coastal plain ecosystems barely get into here. The interior low plateau, which is really more like an extension of the Appalachians, barely get over into here. And so we're at the edge of a lot of these major physiographic regions, these major kind of ecological biomes that just make it into Illinois. So it's no surprise then that the species that really call those regions or those biomes home just barely get into the state, and thus we consider them rare in Illinois. So you can find in our state, things like southern cypress Tupelo swamps, places like this that are much more common farther south, but do just make it into Illinois. I always like to sneak pictures of my kids into talks, so that's a good excuse to use this. Or, these rocky, dry Ozarkian forest and species just barely get into our state. And so kind of the geographic position of Illinois in the center of the U.S. and touching all these different major ecological regions create a situation where we have a lot of rare species that are rare in Illinois but may not be rare across their whole range. A good example of this would be shortleaf pine. So shortleaf pine is super common across its range throughout the southeast. But in Illinois, if you can see on the map there, it barely sneaks into our state such that we only have really 2 locations where it's natively found in Illinois. And so this is one of those. This is LaRue Pine Hills, named the Pine Hills after a population of shortleaf pine. And so this would be considered a rare species in the state, even though it's by no means rare across its landscape. And we see this time and time again. Chestnut oak just sneaks into Illinois, kind of from the east, but where you find it in the state, that it's can be kind of abundant where it's found, but it's really restricted to certain habitats and right at the edge of its range. Willow oak, same thing, sneaks into the Illinois from the coastal plain. Again, we see this over and over. And if you just take one group like the oaks and look at that, out of the 20 oak species that we have in Illinois, 9 of them, I would say that we are part of their core distribution, their core range. But then 11 of the species we have in the state, I would say that we are only at the edge of their range. So its core range is somewhere else, and it barely gets into Illinois. And so that's being at the edge of these ranges really built us a lot of diversity in our oak species. Now, species at the edge of their range, there's some thoughts that they're more vulnerable at the edge of their range. They the edge of their range just simply means that you're at the limits of what their habitat or climate suitability is. So they're not going to necessarily perform as well there. They're subject to stochastic events, weather events, disasters that may impact them and cause their range to constrict. They're more subject to shifts in climate since they're already at the edge of their suitability. And so species at the edge of their range, that's where they're often most vulnerable. There's definitely been some discussions and debates on how important it is to protect species at the edge of their range. If a species is stable overall its core range and it barely sneaks into your state, is it worth protecting that species? It is good to note that often species at the edge of their range is where you get stress adaptation, speciation, evolutionary innovation as well, and then you can build genetic diversity for that population. So I think there's a lot of high conservation value for protecting these populations of a species that occur kind of at the edge of its geographic range. It's still part of an ecosystem there, and then it also has a lot of these kind of species level benefits for adaptation and future speciation. So what I wanted to do now is just jump into these different rare tree species. I decided to break them into some categories to make them a little more, make it flow a little better. And so what I'm going to start with are groups of species that are the core range is more south. So these are groups that these are species that are really at the edge of their range, that their core range is in the southern U.S. So you'll see a lot of species that you might expect to find in Alabama and Tennessee that just sneak into here. The first one I want to talk about is Carolina buckthorn. I really like talking about Carolina buckthorn because that group of plants, the buckthorns, is known really best known for the problematic invaders. You know, we have common buckthorn and glossy buckthorn, which are two of the biggest problem species we have in the state in terms of invasive plants. This is one of a couple native buckthorns that we do have in the state. And this one is found kind of in the southern area, the southern area of the state and farther south. It's a small tree, kind of a small understory tree, but a beautiful tree. And the one thing I like is it's being used more and more as an ornamental. I think it's a beautiful tree and one that should be used more. It has the red berries and then the little oval leaves with those straight veins that really make it noticeable and it makes it stand out. You can see there on the map that it occurs in quite a few counties in southern Illinois, but it's even within those counties, it's kind of a spotty distribution. You're going to find Carolina buckthorn and mesic to dry upland forest. Often I see it more in calcareous soil, so over top of limestone. And then it does also seem to like forest edges, the edges of barrens and things like that. Where you find it in some places, it can be very abundant, but it does like those calcareous soils is what I've seen. A neat species, one that's an integral part to a lot of the forest here in the southern part of the state. The next is swamp tupelo. And so we talked about the cypress tupelo swamps earlier, where we get cypress and water tupelo that makes its way into southern Illinois. And water tupelo, while not abundant across the state, is fairly common in those wetland habitats in southern Illinois. This is a closely related species to that water tupelo, is swamp tupelo. A little smaller on average, a little different species, but it is really rare in the state. We don't have much of it at all. It can be distinguished from the much more common water tupelo. The leaves are very noticeably white on the underside, so it's bicolored that way. These dark purple berries on it, and it only really is found in, I think, one county in the state. This tree that we were looking at in this picture here on the left is actually our state champion tree. So it's our biggest that we know of. We don't know of many trees in the state. It's likely one that is more common in the right habitat. It's just misidentified for the more common water tupelo. So you're going to find swamp tupelo in swamps, obviously, very wet bottomland forest, wet riparian areas. It really likes frequent shallow inundation. It can handle pond edges, swamp edges. It can handle really wet feet. So that's where you're going to find this one in the southern reaches of the state. Another southern species that makes its way into Illinois, and this is a state threatened species, is water elm. Water elm is not a true elm at all. It's a very small tree, more of a big shrub, but it does have elm-like leaves or almost birch-like leaves, and so that's where it gets its name. This is another swamp species. You'll find it growing right out of the water like this. You'll find it in the southern reaches of the Cache River or along the Ohio River in the sloughs and backwaters there. But those zigzag branches, those elm-like or almost birch-like leaves, and then the small stature. And then this is the state champion tree, the one on the left here. And we were out measuring these and finding this, and this is me on the right with one of my colleagues on the left. And if you notice, I am wearing trash bags as waders because I forgot my waders at home that day, but it did not let it stop me to go out and measure some of these big trees. And then just in case if you're wondering, trash bags as waders are very ineffective, so I would not recommend it. You're going to find water elm, again, swamps, very, very wet bottomland forest, riparian areas, stream sides. It can handle frequent or almost nearly permanent inundation, so it does like it very wet. Moving out of the swamps, but still into southern species, Bigleaf Snowbell. This is another small tree, large shrub, and it is state endangered. And so this one is one that we thought we only had one known population in the state over on the west side of southern Illinois until very recently. And actually a group of us about 18 months ago or so were hiking and doing actually an invasive species survey on the east side, southeast side of Illinois in Pope County, and came across the second known population of this plant. Beautiful species, beautiful flowers on it. It's a clonal species, and so you get these big groups, you know, that sometimes can be a quarter of an acre or larger, and it's a clonal. But a really unusual species in terms of when we first found it, it was in the winter. The leaves weren't on, but it has these kind of stacked buds where you'll get 2 to 3 or 4 sometimes buds, leaf buds all together above a leaf scar. Really unusual looking different plant like that, but the clonal nature, dark bark, rounded leaves, and then those beautiful flowers on it really make it stand out where you have it. Again, super rare, known now from just 2 populations in 2 different counties in southern Illinois. And we have this in really mesic upland hardwood forest. It seems to prefer north or east facing slopes or coves. We found these mid-slope or a little higher up on the shoulder. We don't know if there's more of this one. You know, the second population we found 18 months ago was found way back in a wilderness area. So it's not an area that's frequented. We hope to continue to look for this one. It's starting to flower about now. So we hope to hopefully find more populations of this one than is known. But a really, really neat plant. Another southern species, water hickory, and this is another state threatened species. So we have 10 different hickories. 3 of those hickories are what's called the pecan hickories. And so they are functionally, ecologically a little different than the rest of the hickories. They tend to have a lot more leaflets per leaf. They tend to have winged fruit, and then more naked buds, not the traditional buds. And so water hickory looks a lot like a pecan. If you just walk up to it, it has some of that platy bark to it, the large leaflet numbers. But the fruit look quite a bit different. They're more rounded instead of that elongated like a pecan, and they grow in wetter habitats. But you can see lots of leaflets per tree on there, and then those kind of naked buds like you would expect with a pecan as well. And this occurs in southern Illinois in really wet areas, sloughs, bottomland forest, riparian areas. Really neat tree. It can get pretty big. Some of the bigger trees can be really shaggy and almost look a little bit like a shellbark hickory, but usually they're more platy bark like a pecan. Pretty neat looking tree. Another one I would imagine is misidentified a lot as well. Moving out of those southern species into groups that I think are more Appalachian disjuncts. And so these are species that you would expect to find if you were in the Shenandoah Valley or in the Great Smoky Mountains, places like that. And then they've kind of taken advantage of that connection through the interior low plateau, that kind of similar habitat from the Appalachians that move west to also grow in this area. The first is Silverbell. So Silverbell is state endangered tree. It is a beautiful tree, long leaves, and then beautiful kind of hanging down bell-like flowers on it. The bark to me is always very, very diagnostic for Silverbell. It looks like it's coffee stains that somebody dumped coffee on it. A little bit like a black cherry, but not quite. Really, when they get big, it stands out. And then when they fruit, they have these really weird kind of four-winged fruit that hang down on it like this. And really only found in far southern Illinois along the Ohio River, kind of in the wooded areas there. But a neat plant, again, very much more common south and east as you get into the Appalachians, but just makes its way into southern Illinois. You'll find this one at some stream banks as long as the soil is well drained enough, mesic slopes, wooded ravines, places like that. And then similarly, Yellowwood. So that's another one of these Appalachian disjuncts that's found. This one's interesting in that it is super common as an ornamental and is actually growing in popularity. So it is a native species and it does natively grow in Illinois, but it's much farther spread in terms of ornamental plantings. You'll find this across the whole state planted. It is a member of the bean family, and so it's going to have those pea-like or bean-like flowers, big clusters of them, very fragrant. This one's interesting in that we have a lot of pinnately compound trees with pinnately compound leaves in the state. Think about ash or hickories, walnuts, all these different ones. And this is another pinnately compound tree. So if you see the picture of the leaf on the bottom right here, you can see that's all one leaf. This one differs from a lot of the other trees in that the leaflets that are in the leaf are actually alternate. So if you see that's whole one leaf, but there's only one leaflet at a time. Most of our other pinnately compound trees that have leaflets, those leaflets are going to be opposite. So there's two leaves at one time coming out from the rachis on the leaf. Whereas this one, there's one at a time. And as far as I know, that's really the only one that we have in the state that's like that. And so it really makes it stand out. But it has tight bark, smooth bark, very similar to a beech or something like that. Doesn't get nearly as big as beech do, but those flowers and those unusual leaflet kind of growth type is really what gets you to Yellowwood. Really a beautiful tree. And again, widely planted. This is one that's planted here along the Illinois River. This is actually in Peoria. So you can see it's been planted across the whole state, but naturally found just in a few spots in southern Illinois. Where you'll find this one is really rich mesic slopes, lower slopes, well-drained bottomlands. It likes a lot of nutrients, a lot of fertility, but doesn't like its feet being wet. So well-drained, rich soil is where you'll find this one in the right habitat. And then moving over to our cucumber magnolia or Cucumbertree, as I mentioned, one of my favorite rare trees in the state, and really an unusual looking tree. If you've been to the Appalachians or been to the Smoky Mountains, you know there's a lot of trees that are in this Magnolia genus. A lot of these are big-leafed trees, and so they'll have leaves that are 2 feet to 3 feet long, really interesting. This one's not quite like that, so its leaves will be, you know, a foot long at times, and it's bigger than a lot of those other ones. So this can be a big, full-size tree, but really an unusual-looking tree. It's got the traditional magnolia-type flowers, the little fruit spikes that come up that almost look like a little cucumber, and then again those bigger leaves like this. A neat tree. This is one that I grew up with in the southern Appalachians, where I grew up in Kentucky, and really always loved this tree, and I'm super excited to find it growing here in the state. You'll find this one in rich woods, coves, lower slopes as well. It's mixed in with a lot of other kind of mesic species, rich species, where you'll find it. Jumping into habitat specialists. So these are species that I think are rare because they require a really specialized type of habitat that's not often found. And so you're going to have to really drill in to find these, find that habitat type before you'll find these species. So the first is northern white cedar. So northern white cedar is barely comes into the northern part of Illinois. You may mistake it for eastern red cedar, but it does look quite a bit different. It doesn't have as much of the pokey kind of spiny leaves on it as well. It's a little more unarmed. This one is widely used as an ornamental as well. Just a beautiful tree, one of our few evergreen trees that we have natively in Illinois. So you would find northern white cedar really in the far reaches of northern Illinois, just in a few counties, but it's going to be forested fens, seeps, springs. Those areas are where you'll find it. If you go farther north in its range where it's more common, it can be in rocky bluffs and some other areas. But in our state, you're looking for those wetland types in northeastern Illinois is where you're going to mostly find this one. Another habitat specialist is water locust. And so we're all probably familiar with the super common honey locust, right? It's the bane of many farmers as it gets into their fields and punches holes in their tractor tires. Super common across the state. This is a cousin to honey locust. It looks very similar in that it has the branched thorns, the tight gray bark, the pinnately compound leaves with the little tiny leaflets. So it can easily be misidentified. This one, although grows in wetland habitats, and the easiest way to tell them apart would be by the fruit. So if you know honey locust fruit, it has those big, long seed pods with many, many seeds in the seed pods, and often those seed pods are curling a little bit or things like that. Water locust doesn't really have that. So it has seed pods that usually have 1 or maybe 2 seeds per pod. So they're very short little seed pods, as you can see in the picture here, and that really makes it stand out and different when it's in fruit. Easy to tell apart from honey locust. But it is a bean, another one in that bean family. So it'll have fragrant flowers, pea-like flowers. They're little clusters of them. And again, just like honey locust, but these have these single seeded or maybe 2 seeds per pod, these very shorter seed pods. You can see it really noticeable when you see it. And again, this one is found mostly in southern Illinois, but spread along the rivers a little farther north. But it does require specialized habitat. This is one that really wants its feet wet. Swamps, wet bottomland forests, sloughs, those are areas where you're going to find water locust. If you're outside of that, if the soil dries out much at all, it's not going to grow there. So it needs that wetland habitat for it to grow. But a really neat plant, and one that I think is often, people see it and just assume it's a honey locust that's growing in a wet area. The next of our habitat specialist is Tamarack or larch. So we do have the commonly used ornamental European larch, which is found across the state. We do have this native one. It's state threatened. And this is an unusual tree in that it is a one of the two, I guess, deciduous coniferous trees that we have in the state. So like bald cypress, it is gymnosperm, but it loses its leaves. So in the fall, it'll have that beautiful yellow color to it, and really neat that way. So ecologically, it's a little different than many of our others, simply because it is a deciduous conifer. But it has these little clusters of needles, again, that turn bright yellow and fall off, and it's really just found naturally in the northeastern part of the state, even though it is commonly used as an ornamental, not as much as the European larch. But this one, Tamarack's going to be found in forested bogs, often found associated with areas with a lot of sphagnum moss. Is where you're going to find that one. Really kind of restricted habitat to those. And if you go to other areas, it may have a bit broader habitat types, but for Illinois, you're looking for forested bogs, and again, tied in with sphagnum moss is where you would find it. The next, it's another state endangered species, is gumbully. Gumbully is one of those weird species that has about 15 different names. People call it a lot of different things. Woolly buckthorn is another one I've heard commonly used, but it seems like everybody calls it something different. Really an unusual looking tree. It has woolly leaves, big thorns on them. It's not a big tree, so it'll get to, I've seen it 20, 25 feet tall at most. A lot of times it's kind of multi-stem tree, but really kind of a tough looking tree, right? All those thorns, scrubby looking tree, those thick leaves with all the fuzz on them and on the hairs on them growing on it. And so it's neat looking tree. It's found just in a few counties, mostly kind of in the East St. Louis area or in that region. But this one, it's a habitat specialist in that I've always seen it. Every place I've seen this one, it's at the edge of the forest, at the edge of a barren or a hill prairie, or the top of a cliff, someplace like that, where I think it must have a high light requirement, and so it loves the edges. So this is one that probably historically was more common in Illinois when we had more fire on the landscape. We had larger amounts of barrens or intact hill prairies. This was probably a species that kind of always stayed at the edge of those hill prairies. In times where we had lots more fire or drier conditions and the hill prairies expanded, this one probably moved back a little bit. But as the hill prairies contracted, this was one of those species that moved into them. And so that's kind of where it's found now. You've got to find hill prairies or the tops of cliffs. I've seen it in calcareous soils over limestone is usually where I find it, but it seems to really specialize in that it's associated with those open habitats along the western side of the state. Really a neat looking plant. I think it's one that it's one of my favorites out there as well, just because it's so kind of rough looking and tough looking, and because of where it grows, and it's hard to get to sometimes. Getting into, I have one species that I consider a stressed out species. And so I have that in there, and the reason I put that one species category, because I think it's an important one to mention, and it's stressed out really because of an exotic invasive, diseases, some problems with it. And, that's butternut. I think butternut, also called white walnut. I grew up calling it white walnut, but I think around here, butternut's the more commonly used name for it. Was super common, right? This was all over the state, a very common tree, closely related to black walnuts. You find it in many places, although nowadays it is much more hard to find in certain areas. There seems to be less and less of it. I'm sure there's still pockets where it's doing fine, but across its range, It seems to be suffering from butternut canker, which is a disease that impacts it pretty heavily. This one you could mistake for a hickory, for sure, just by the bark and the leaves. But of course, its fruit looks very much like a black walnut fruit with those fuzzy husks that doesn't have often obvious seams. This one is much more elongated in its fruit. The bark itself is lighter colored than walnut for sure, hence the name white walnut. And then the leaves are similar, although this one typically has a larger terminal leaflet, whereas on many black walnuts it doesn't have that terminal leaflet. But very similar twigs. If you cut open the twigs, they're going to be chambered just like a black walnut. But again, you can see the range map I have there, kind of found historically across the whole state. But much more infrequent now, much more rare now, in most part due to its impacts from the butternut canker disease that seems to be impacting it. You know, I've given this talk at a couple other places in the state, and it's interesting that there's a few places that butternut does seem to be hanging on fine, and there's groves of it that's doing well, even though every butternut that I've known growing up is now dead. So I've seen just in the last 30 years really a precipitous drop in the numbers kind of across its whole range. But you're going to find butternut you know, in rich mesic forest. So it's a natural part of our ecosystems there. Again, much was pretty common across the state in these habitats. Now much less so. The last species I want to mention for rare trees is what I consider the rarest of the rare. And again, one of my favorite trees. It was really fun finding this tree and photographing it. And so I call it the rarest of the rare because to the best of my knowledge, there's really only one known population of this species currently in Illinois, and there's 7 or 8 individuals. And so that's pale hickory. Carya pallida obviously stayed endangered. This is one we thought we had more populations, but the more we've looked at it, we think that most of those populations, except for the one, turn out to be misidentifications for some of the other hickories. I'm sure you know hickories sometimes are very hard to distinguish. Pale hickory is an interesting one, and if you see on the pictures here in the top left, we have one of the terminal buds. You can see it has all these little gold flecks on the buds, really noticeable on it. So I think that's one of the characteristics. On the underside of the leaves, if you look at it, it has all those same kind of gold flecks on the underside of the leaf. On the rachis, it'll have little clusters of hairs that grow on the rachis as well. And then even on the fruit, the husk on the fruit, it'll have this kind of goldish sheen on it from those little fleckings. And that's one of the main ways to tell it apart from the others. Typically has 5 to 7 leaflets, and it's not a very big tree. The bark looks a little different than some of the other hickories. It's not quite as dark, so it's more pale in color, hence its name. And it's doesn't quite have that same diamondy pattern that we're so familiar with a lot of our hickories. But again, one population known from the LaRue Pine Hills area. If you go west into Missouri, into those sand hills there, you'll have a lot more of it. If you go south, you'll find a lot more of it, but it just sneaks into the state. And this is one, again, we thought we had more of this one, but it turns out most of them we think are just misidentifications. And this, to the best of my knowledge, the only population we know of. And it grows right at the edge of the cliff at the Pine Hills there. And so you can see a couple of the individuals very easily, and the rest, I don't dare trek that way down to see them just because I'm worried about falling off the cliff. But a neat plant, a wonderful plant to go check out and to get some pictures of. This is going to grow in Illinois in very dry uplands. It's mixed in with some of that shortleaf pine hardwood forest that you'll find farther in other areas of its range. Outside of those very dry, rocky uplands, it likes well-drained, sandy soils. That's where you'll find it. Hickories in general can be tough to identify. They're a neat group of species. Again, we have 10 different ones in the state, and I highlighted 2 of them here. but a great group to kind of get familiar with. And this is, again, what I think the rarest of the rare tree species here in the state. So I'll spend the last bit of time of this presentation just kind of going over management and protection of rare species. And there's a couple ways that species are protected in the state. One, through the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory, which was an inventory that's been done a couple times in the state now, really to document and record intact, high-quality natural areas across the state. Some of these rare species are considered significant features there of note, and that gives them, gives natural areas, gives them kind of points, if you will, to being considered a state natural area if it has a certain number of these rare species. Having rare species is also another reason that a site might be designated a nature preserve and then given kind of protection in perpetuity for that land. And then we can put these species on the threatened and endangered species list as well to give them more protection. There's not as much legal protection with the state endangered species list, but it does give them protection and priority for management. And so in the state, we do have an Endangered Species Protection Board that meets regularly, evaluates species, and then looks at data in terms of where they're found and where they've been recorded in the trends to make decisions on listing species. In the state, our state listed species can be there because they're a federal listed species. Some of the state listed species were formerly widespread in Illinois, but have now been nearly extirpated from the state or in steep decline. They could be species that exhibit very restricted geographic ranges, of which Illinois is a part, or they have restricted habitats or low populations in the state, or it could be that in Illinois it's a significant disjunct from its core range. And these are all different reasons that are listed. For a species being listed in the state. And we have quite a few, right? So you can see here just a quick list of the Illinois endangered tree species. We mentioned some of them, but there's definitely others on the list that we just didn't have time to mention here. And then we even have a few state threatened species as well. It's important, one of the interesting things that when they evaluate species and they look at whether to list something, whether to take it off the list or add it, it's important. They have to look at data. And so it's important in the state, we have a thing called the Elemental Occurrence Record, and that's through the Department of Natural Resources, and it's a way of tracking populations of rare species. And so that's really vital, and a lot of biologists, botanists, people out on the ground doing plant surveys or looking at rare species fill out these elemental occurrence records to basically document and record where these species are. And those records takes a bit to record them, and I wish more people would submit them when they find some of these rare species, because they really are vital to understanding the populations and the trends for a lot of these rare species. So with that, there's so much more we could have covered, many more species. I just wanted to cover over some of those quickly and kind of highlight rare species in the state, because I think it's fun, it's neat to learn more about them, and I'll be happy to take any questions that we have. And feel free to submit questions into the chat box.
Chris. So we have
I lost you there, Kevin.
We have several. Can you hear me?
Yes, I got you now.
I think I lost audio.
Uh-oh.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Kevin.
So we got several questions here. First one, I thought oaks were pretty promiscuous. Do we get any hybrids?
Good question. So yes, a lot of our oaks do hybridize. Some of those hybridizations are, not necessarily stable hybridizations. That means we'll find find examples or hybrids here and there, but they don't necessarily maintain or reproduce. And there's others that are a little more stable. But yes, oaks are known to hybridize quite a bit, and that just makes identifying them even that more difficult.
Okay. Do you see the edge range species extending further into Illinois as climate changes?
That's a really good question, for sure. You know, with tree species, there's a bit of a delay with climate change. They have long generation times. It takes a lot more time for those species really to expand their range. So me personally, no, I've not seen, you know, rare species that just occur in southern Illinois actively expanding their range due to climate change. We have seen that with some other, other plant species that are a little more, have a little higher, quicker reproduction time or quicker generation time, annuals or things like that. But tree species, we haven't seen that. I wouldn't doubt that it will happen, but that's actually one of the concerns with tree species is that since they're big, they're slow generation time, there is some worry that they may not be able to shift and adjust to climate change as quick as other species, especially as quickly as our climate's changing now.
Okay. Another person asked, is it okay to plant a shoemark oak in central Illinois?
Yeah, I think so. You know, shoe-marked oak occurs across the southern third, maybe a little more of the state. I think if you're planting them up there, again, we talked about climate change. I think there's no problem with that. It's gonna probably move into a better habitat suitability for it anyway. But yeah, I think there's no problem.
Okay. I think someone answered that one. How is the butternut canker disease spread?
That's a good question too. That's not one that I don't know a lot about how it's spread. You know, a lot of these canker diseases or diseases in general, you know, can spread through spores, spread on insects moving it around. A lot of times cankers will ooze and have some, kind of sweet uh, uh, discharge out of it that insects will feed on and maybe move it around. Some other diseases are viral and they'll move through piercing insects with piercing or sucking parts that'll spread them that way. So a lot of times it's either wind moving spores or insects carrying them around.
Okay. This next one is kind of a two-part question. Why is the pale hickory so rare or endangered? And is the pale hickory endangered only in Illinois or in other parts of the US?
Sure. So it's endangered in the state, and it's rare in the state simply because we are at the absolute edge of its range. We're at the edge of its habitat suitability. The ideal habitat or suitable habitat even just barely occurs in our state. That's why it's rare. It is not rare, not that rare anyway, across other parts of its range. You know, it's farther west and south and farther south as well. In those areas, you know, they have more suitable habitat, more habitat that's conducive for that plant to compete well and be able to grow. We simply don't have that much of that kind of habitat in Illinois.
Okay. One person asked, what is the most useful tree guide for Illinois?
Well, I would say selfishly, you should use the Forest Trees of Illinois, which is produced by the Illinois Extension Forestry. Uh, That's always a good one. It covers a lot of the species. And there's others. There's other tree species, tree groups. There's a great two-part publication out of Indiana, the Woody Plants of Indiana, or Woody Trees of Indiana, and Shrubs of Indiana. Um, they cover all the species here in Illinois as well, and that's a great companion to have. But for a good field guide, you can't go wrong with the Forest Trees of Illinois.
Okay. Is the shagbark hickory common in Illinois?
Yes, so shagbark hickory is one of our most common trees. It is found in every county in the state, and if you look at the FAA data, which is the Forest Inventory and Analysis data that has plots across all of Illinois, in terms of volume, shagbark hickory is one of the top 5 trees in the state.
Okay. Is there a complete list of endangered or threatened tree species in Illinois?
There is. So you would go to the Illinois Endangered Species Protection Board website. You could just Google for that, and they have a list of all threatened and endangered species there, and it's broken apart by taxa. So you could see mussels and or animals, and then you could see plants. So it doesn't have the trees separated out just into trees, but it has a list of all the threatened and endangered plants on there.
Okay, great. How is the tamarack related or not related to the tamarack tamarisk of the American West?
It's a good question. So tamarisk in the West is a genus that's actually invasive. It's not native to the West. It's a big issue. They look a little bit alike, but our tamarack is in the Styrax genus, and so they're different genera. They just have a similar sounding name.
Okay. Are there nurseries that specialize in propagation of rare species to sell to homeowners?
Not that I know of. I haven't heard of that. There are some botanic gardens that really focus a lot of their research and a lot of their effort on conservation of rare species, but they're not necessarily aimed at having people plant them out and things like that. So I don't know of any nurseries that specifically do that.
Okay. Another person asked, have there been any sightings of Durka?
Yeah, so Durka's a neat one. So Durka palustris is one that I could have added to here, and I probably should have. It's called leatherwood, and it is a neat shrub. I guess you call it a shrub. Very, large shrub in the state that you'll find in certain kind of specialized habitats, and there's it's across the state. Again, it's never very common, but if you know where to look for it, you can certainly find it.
Okay. Is there any active logging being done in Illinois, and what kind of trees, if so?
Okay, yes, so there is. So Illinois does have a forest industry, and there's logging done on, private and some public lands in the state. By and large, most of our timber harvests in the state are hardwoods, and so we do grow very good hardwoods here. We have, oak, black walnut's an important one as well, and then there's a lot of other hardwood species. We have some pine harvest as well, but there's not as much going on in the state. There's not as much market for it as the hardwoods. I will say though that harvest is something that can be an important management tool, and it's a way to keep forest healthy. So just because there's harvest doesn't mean that it's threatening or even impacting rare species. It could actually be beneficial to some if it's done in the right way.
Okay, great. Let's see, we're getting close to the time allotted. Let me see. This person wanted to clarify this presentation's angle is looking specifically at naturally occurring populations and not populations introduced by humans, such as an ornamental. Is that so?
Correct. Yes. So I was focusing on rare species that are native to Illinois and their naturally occurring populations, and that's a good point to make because things like we talked about yellowwood, shortleaf pine. Those are species that have been planted much more widely across the state than they naturally occur. And so yellowwood for ornamental, shortleaf pine for forestry and for erosion mitigation. So what I wanted to focus on today was naturally occurring native populations.
Okay. Let's see, one more here. Are there any rare species that are considered keystone trees for a healthy forest?
That's a good species. That's a good question. So keystone species, if people don't know what that means, that's the idea that the presence of that species is vital to that community, to that ecosystem. It's a driver of that ecosystem. Um, it's hard to say yes or no. I would say one of the ones that jump into my mind as a keystone species for a particular ecosystem, would be something like chestnut oak. And so chestnut oak occurs in Illinois really in a very specified habitat. It likes shallow, rocky soils and dry, south-facing slopes. And it is the driver for that kind of really xeric forest ecosystem where it's found. So that's one good example. Usually rare species are rare, even rare components of those ecosystems, so they wouldn't be necessarily the drivers.
Okay, great. We've answered most of the questions. There might be a couple more in here. Maybe one more. So this person asked, they believe they have a tamarack tree on their property. If folks wanted to report a rare tree, how would they report an occurrence?
If you think you have a really rare species like that, I would probably contact your local Department of Natural Resources office. So they are the group, either those or the Nature Preserves Commission office. They are the group that really look at rare species, track species, develop elemental occurrence records. And so they will probably get you in contact with your local heritage biologist, and you can talk to them or send them a picture of it to figure it out that way.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. I believe that's about all the time we had.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Kevin, for managing the questions. And I definitely want to thank everybody for attending this presentation. You will send the recording out in a couple days, and I'll also include links to next week's final presentation for our spring webinar series. Thanks again, and have a great rest of the day.